Ladies and gentlemen, dear David, thank you very much for the very warm welcome here in London, and to be invited to tell you more about our, not only the recent work, but the way how we as a team see the development of Hatusha and the Hittite capital city, as I called it, from an Anatolian principality to an international metropolis. By the way, the word metropolis, of course, is here used more than as a figure than that I think it's a metropolis in a modern way. But it was one of the biggest cities of its time, and the question should be allowed how it developed and why it became such an important and unique site. The first slide is showing you the city as a whole. From a plane, from the north, you see the rough environment, and this environment and the relation between human and the environment will play one role in my present talk. Before I start, I just want to make sure that we all remember where we are in the central highlight of Anatolia, of Asia Minor, in an area which is actually not to be expected a country which should support and feed an empire. So, and until it was proven that the site is actually the Hittite capital city, and the Hittites were known from texts, at least from the Amarna texts, when Macready and Winkler started their work there in 1906. No one would have expected one of the major empires of the ancient Near East to be in that rough highland. And still today, this is a puzzling question. As you see, the different states of climate, it's very dry in summers, cold and really icy in winter, a rough terrain. So actually, it's still amazing how the Hittites survived there. When does it all begin? It began in the Chalcolithic period, during a time when in the southern parts of Anatolia, like Çatalhöyük, or in the southeastern part of Anatolia, much or rather complex societies already flourished. Here we have the first traces of settled life only after 5,500 BC. It's a period of more or less, 1,500 to 2,000 years, covered by several sites, which you can see here, some of on the map, in the vicinity of Boğazköy and beyond, of course. And thanks to the long-running excavations in Boğazköy, several directors, Kurt Bittel, Jürgen Seher, and myself, took up the chance to research such places. The last excavations we did were actually executed by Ulf Schoop, at that time still at the DAI in Istanbul, now at the University of Edinburgh. And I don't want to go much into detail, but there are some things which are interesting and which should be mentioned, because I want to pinpoint the sharp contrast between what's happened before the Hittites founded Hatusha as a capital city and the difference to the Hittite city. So we are confronted with small settlements, made up by a few houses. Here, one-room, single-room houses. Some have two. Not a very complex economy, but an economy, at least in the later part, as we see here in Çamlıbel, in the 4th millennium, based on the use of raw materials of a complex or rather complicated way to extract copper, to melt copper, and then to make tools. But as we see here, these are the 3 excavated sites, Yarıkaya, Büyükkaya, Çamlıbel, and there are many others, as I said. These were rather short-lived. They were not surviving for hundreds or even thousands of years. The period I mentioned, starting around 5,500 with Büyükkaya, and ended in Çamlıbel-Talarsı. That doesn't mean that Büyükkaya was living and surviving for 1,500 years. No, it was only surviving for a few dozen years, maybe a few decades, maybe 50, 60 years. And due to the careful excavations of Ufshop and modern dating methods, it was clear visible, and we could clearly understand that we have to deal with a horizontal type of stratigraphy, that these people were moving around in the countryside and living at one place as long as the surrounding was not extincted, and when the resources were overstressed, they just moved on for the next, within an area of a kilometer or two. And this scheme of settlements most probably continued throughout the third millennium. So in a period where in the more southern parts of Anatolia, south of this mountain range here, large urban sites, early urban sites and urban sites like Kültepe, like Acemhöyük, like Alişehöyük, like Konyakarahöyük, Beyci Sultan, and developed and flourished. Complex towns, even early states emerged. Here, in this area, we are still confronted with these shifting and continuously shifting settlements. Even some are on top, as here, or close by. The Chalcolithic ones, they have nothing to do with each other. There is always a change in place in between, so we don't have this continuous settlements as we are used to have in Anatolia and other areas. And this is due to the landscape and to the harsh environment and the difficulties to survive in this environment. And as I hope to demonstrate in the following pictures, or in the continuing pictures, it was the way the Hittites dealt with these obstacles that they are able to found such a large city, as you see here in its largest extent, at least the walled city in its largest extent. A site here, the city wall, a site of nearly 200 hectares in a rough terrain. We should remember the first slide with all these rocky outcrops, with these plateaus here. There's a difference in elevation from the lower town to the uppermost part of more than nearly 400 meters. So that's quite a difficult terrain. And it was long puzzling why the Hittites founded the city here. I will return to this question later. At the very beginning, of the very beginning, we don't have a lot of remains, only encountered in very narrow trenches and accidental trenches, to say. But as you can see here on the schematic plan, widely spread already. One should have maybe used the topographical map, so one would see that it's a different topography, plateau, lowland, plateau again. Here the gorge between Büyükkaya and Büyükkale is running in between. So around 2000, a town has been founded with different, or covering a complex topography, showing up different kinds of architecture, different functions, incorporating industrial areas and so on. So we have, at the very beginning, a full developed city. And this continued then in what we call the Karen period, or the Assyrian trade colonies period, Middle Bronze Age, with a complex structure. Here you have a part of the settlement excavated in the 30s with these houses, the same as in Kültepe. Then, but different from Kültepe, we have a state-run granary or storage facility, not a granary, a storage facility. On top of Büyükkale, we have very complex and big houses. Here in these trenches, very scattered houses, and even in the upper city, we were able in 2007 to detect first remains of a possible Karen period settlement. So the same, it's a developing town, it's a town which has the same characteristics as other early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age cities. I want to show you now here in the southern part of the lower town, this is the later big Hittite temple, here's the plan. I want to show you some recent results. Again, houses, but the interesting thing is here that the Hittite walls, the earliest Hittite walls, which we recently, just a few days ago or before I came here, I received the new carbon dates from a room just adjacent here. This Hittite wall is immediately sitting on top of the burned foundations of the Karen period. And as it comes out, the dates, the carbon dates are already of the Karen period. This is this room here, indicating a rather low date. And the Hittite remains are also well in the 17th century. So the gap, which has been proposed on historical thinking or historical texts, might not be as big as it was suggested, or from my point of view, there wasn't any gap. So this is one of the very interesting results we have now, together with small finds, tablets, or at least 2 tablets, a very interesting ritual, a remarkable ritual vase, and maybe not so, but very interesting, we had quite a lot of good preserved pottery, and by this pottery we were able to, for the first time, to show that there are distinct regional areas of living or of material culture within central Anatolia in this period. So what we see is that it's a normal Anatolian town continuously developing here, and even this continues then into the Hittite period, as we see from these pictures. Again, well, this is the city in the north, the northern part of the Karen period. This is the Hittite, city of the older and Middle Hittite period. And as you see, it's the same dwindling streets, irregular houses, and so on. So this has nothing to do with what we see just a few years later, when the Hittites built this enormous complex, the temple in the middle, the storerooms, and a probably administrative building. Unfortunately, in the last years we tried to get below these buildings by sondages. Unfortunately, the results are not so as expected. So we were not able to really date the construction of the temple, but on typological reasons, you will see a little later, it is rather clear that the temple is or should be dated to the 16th, maybe even, or 15th, or even 16th century. And by this building, by the construction of that building, by the construction of new roads leading here from a city gate up, and here was a large plaza, a large square, and then leading up to the royal fortress, the lower part of the city gets a new orientation, a new structure, and obviously with a new ideological connotation. That's the question I want to raise. When did this happen exactly? And why did this happen? And how did it happen? And I'm quite sure, or I'm quite hopeful that you might follow me with the first results in this for these questions. So again, our excavations in the southern lower town, here on the oldest Hittite city wall. This wall is important because here we can see 2 different ways of this casemate wall system. This is different from this one here, if you have a look on the towers. And this is indicating some chronological development of this structure. And on the other hand, as you will see later, but I can say it already, we have carbon dates for this big granary here. And so, because the granary, and there's a stratigraphical connection to the city wall, so we can adopt the granary dates also for the city wall. And this was the starting point to understand more of the changes the city obviously went through in the 17th century. And the story happens around this large rock. Here you have a side picture, an air view, and as visible from the air here, there are all cuts and bits and pieces cut onto this rock. A detailed surveying of this rock and of these structures. Here the cuttings are visible here again. It is very clear that this rock was built upon, that it was part of a large building founded, when? And that's what since 2010, we continued just to the south of this rock, here in this gorge. We lately understood that this corridor was emptied by the first excavations in 1911 by Macready, and unfortunately there's no documentation. So I assume, and I would assume, that Macready already saw parts of this building, because the destruction we are encountering clearly point to this, that they saw it, left it open, and then the villagers pulled out the stones. What you see on the picture is a combination of excavations, large-scale excavations. We recovered a part of a building with rooms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here the wall, and then another wall system here. This might probably a tower of a casemate wall system. Here's the outer edge of this wall system here. And the typical Hittite casemate system consisting of 2 parallel walls. Here's one, there's another one, or here and here, is clearly visible in the geophysical results. So by the combination of excavation and geophysical research, it is possible to say, first of all, that the Hittite city wall, the old city wall, runs down, meets the rock, continues over there, as we saw, and that there's somehow a building adjacent to it. First, we should have a look at the building. It's very monumental, although it doesn't really come out from these pictures, because it's eroded, destroyed partly. Those blocks were pulled out, or the villagers tried to pull them out, I suppose. But for example, this threshold here, there are some other blocks in situ, and this autostot-like wall system is of a quality, the masonry is of a quality which can only be observed at the Great Temple. So I would suggest links in this direction, although we don't have any datable material from this structure, which is interesting or disappointing on the one hand, but on the other hand, that's the normal situation in Boğazköy Hatusha, because most of the buildings, when we encounter them, are intentionally emptied, unfortunately, by the Hittites. And bringing these things together, we have a clear stratigraphical connection between the large building, which is rising up in terraces up the slope. The building is connected to the city wall, and this is continuing further south. Here's the street, unfortunately, cutting through it, but I think that we have to deal with 2 city walls, or 2 fortification systems, an older one and a younger one. And as I said, we have carbon dates due to the excavations by Jürgen Seher from the granary here, which are dating around 1600. I would think that around 1600, this large project of a new city wall, which is mentioned in the texts by Huntily, who says, secured Hatusha with a city wall, or I built a new city wall around Hatusha. May it this wall or may it be something different, that's another discussion. But it fits rather well at the moment. But on archaeological grounds, I think that around 1600, this turn of the city from a normal Anatolian small principality town into a city which is structured and decorated with buildings of special purposes, starts in this time. You might ask what purpose, what function this building might have had. We couldn't excavate it completely yet. I hope we may continue one day. But as I try to show, it is clearly connected to the rock, to the Kesikaya rock, to the corridor. And for the time being, I would suggest that this building has something to do with this rock. And one could make many different suggestions, but one thinks could immediately think about the buildings attached or connected with rocks, playing a major part in the Hittite ancestors cult, like the Hekor buildings. So at least this is one suggestion. What is clear, we have an indigenous Hittite building type here. We have a quality of execution which is clearly connected to the temple, and so to the highest degree of Hittite workmanship. So we see that around 1600, the Hittite state already had developed these characteristics, often of a state which wants to show its power and its might through buildings and through planned structural organization of its settlement. And this is a large difference compared to what we see in sites like Kültepe, Acemhöyük, and so on. Because there, temples as well as palaces, as part of if we talk about monumental architecture, were still in a southern tradition. So the temples of Kültepe as well as the palaces of other mentioned sites are clearly in the southern, not Anatolian tradition. So here we see an indigenous autochthonous development. On top of that all comes here in a sharp break an Iron Age settlement. I just want to show this very interesting and unique standard, which is probably 4th or 3rd century BC, depending on the pottery. And the site wasn't used over a very long period from the Hittite time up to this era. This was only a short excursion. So until 1530, or let's say until the second half of the 16th century, the city was developing in this area, following what we have seen in tradition from the late early Bronze Age through the Karen period into the Hittite period. A first break obviously was around 1600, when we see the new city wall being implemented, the granary, which is a representative state building, and the building I just mentioned. But for some reason that wasn't enough, and after the second, or within the second half of the 16th century, the Hittites started to enlarge the city enormously. The city gained twice of its size within a very short period. We do not know exactly when all this area was built on. I tried to get a few things together, and most of these things were excavated in the 80s by Peter Neve, and Peter Neve had the theory that this part of the settlement was only built or was only erected in the 13th century. But when we look at the temple area, the ponds, Here is another temple, the archives of Nishan Tepe, and so on. There's a whole lot of material from the 16th and 15th centuries. So I think it's reasonable, already based on the old material, to state that the city was already built in this part in the 16th century. And the new material, the recent material, excavated by Jürgen Seher and myself, are showing this as well. Re-evaluating all the material, this is a drawing by Müller-Karpe indicating the typological change of the temple architecture, and as the dating is not based on Hatusha, but on the finds of a site called Kushakle, where the large temple of the weather god belongs to this middle type, and that is dated by dendrochronology into the second half of the 16th century. So the temples of the old type, these ones which are sitting on very prominent high terraces here in the city and the reconstruction, these temples should have been much earlier. The typological development is rather clear, from very irregular ones to very regular ones. And another feature of this newly found part of the city is a very regular and symmetrical layout of the temples or of the buildings around a large square here in the middle, and the buildings are also oriented towards these first temples, so probably built according to them to get especially view access. At the same time, the royal palace was developed and extended. This is of early phase, already with the large terraces, the large terracing, what we then later see in the 13th century fully developed, has been implemented very early onwards, and the same with these large courtyards around which the Hittite royal palace was organized. Therefore, it is possible to say that the Hittites developed an indigenous, local Anatolian way of representative palace architecture very, very early in their reign, separating it even at the very earliest stage from what we see at Kültepe, for example. It's the same with the rest of the city. We already saw this reconstruction. This is the temple area, and as the crown of the city, there was a structure artificially built, 250 meters wide, 70 to 80 meters width, and about 40 meters high. And this, what we today call Jährkappe, was not part of the fortification system, but was a ceremonial structure, on top of which you can see here the restored Sphinx gate. Here's a picture of the replica of the Sphinx, which we put there. And we cannot really date this at the moment. I hope that the study of a graffiti inscription, which was known on this second Sphinx, but brought to my attention again by David Hawkins, may then give us an indication at least of a terminus antiquem. But what I want to say is that the structured building of the site is very evident and is very unique. And this is what really marks the change between the Anatolian principality and the Hittite capital city. This is done as an example of the same period, the monumental fortification structures, the reconstruction of the King's Gate and the Lion's Gate. Here, the situation before we did restoration work, and that's after the conservation. And it's not only the high culture, not only the culture of palaces and temples and things which are connected to the representation of the kings and so on, but also daily life is changing rapidly and very sharply around, again, this date at the turn of the 16th to the 15th century. You see the pottery traditions. This is the pottery developing from the late early Bronze Age through the Karen period until what we call the Middle Hittite period. And then from here onwards, we have this rough, drabware, very homogeneous Hittite common pottery. These distinct shapes, which are also very unique in their form, are all disappeared. And from my point of view, it can't be coincident that this all happens together in the late 16th century. One may discuss still the reasons. It looks as a part of a nation-building process, which might have taken time over, let's say, 100 years. There are social changes. There are the invention of the cuneiform writing for the Hittites, for the Hittite language, for example, and other things, the unification of the Hittite religion, the forming of the Hittite, of a centralized Hittite pantheon, and so on. But there's more going on, and this is something which especially we owe to Jürgen Seher, that the understanding of the economical fundament on which all these things developed, and that's also dating to the 16th century. I talked already about the large silo, and here in the southern part of the city, he excavated ponds, 5 of them, and they are part of much more ponds in the city. I think it's at the moment we are with 9 ponds. Some of them really attested, some assumed. Here these are attested by geophysical research. And so we can clearly understand that the control over water and grain were the major economical innovations of this period, facilitating and allowing the new urbanism visible in the upper town of Hatusha, and not only in the upper town of Hatusha, but as you will see in one of the following slides, all over central Anatolia. And the puzzling question was how these ponds were filled. This pond is 70 meters long, 11 meters wide, and 8 meters deep. So it's a whole lot of water going in there. And a little naive, the archaeologists thought, well, this should have been filled with pipes and tubes and so. But when we start, or I had the chance to give a lecture at a conference in Berlin where also more technical-oriented people were around with engineers, especially water and hydrological engineers. And then they came up and said, this is impossible, that can't work, and we should do a project together. And yes, we did a project together. Here you see this machine which is drilling geological holes into the ground. We did so, and we drilled 4 of them, and within these holes here, we installed machines to measure the up and down rising of the groundwater level, and that shows very interesting results. This is a section through one of the ponds, of the southern ponds. It is cut into a material here which doesn't let water go through, so it's a waterproof material. During summer, the water table is disappearing, so this is more than 8 meters deep, the depth of our pond, so the water is disappearing. Then during the month of October, late October to March, the water table rises, the pond gets filled. It takes about, it's written in German, sorry. It takes about 25 weeks to fill, or it's a period of 25 weeks in which the pond can be filled, and after the water table retreats again or declines again, the water stays within the pond because it cannot run off through this material. And the ponds are placed on the slopes, always at positions where at the hillside they cut into these water ground levels, and the slope side is paved with limestone or other waterproof material. This is the one. So this is a technical innovation. The other one are the silos I talked already about. I don't want to speak too long. Here you see a reconstruction how they might be filled, and these silos are not used for a day-to-day supply of people. With this silo has the size of 2 modern football fields. So within there are still thousands of tons of grain. Juergensee, you can figure out the excavation trench, and they only made test excavations actually over 2 years, and they pulled out about 600 kilos. So there is still thousands of kilos of grain up there. Maybe, as I said wrongly, tons of material, and these materials are stored there under vacuum conditions, and so these vacuum conditions allow the grain to be held there for years and probably more than a decade. So we think that these granaries, there are different architectural types, but that these large granaries mainly served as some kind of a state treasury in order to allow and to have seed material to allow to restart the economy, the economical circle after severe droughts and so on. And just to give you an example, we know from the Ottoman period, but also from the very young period, from the 1890s, that droughts in Anatolia, and the one from 1890 was in Yozgat, just 40 kilometers south of Boğazköy, actually putting hold on the first French test excavations by Chantrey. But that's another story. So this drought in 1890 cost about 150,000 lives, and was impossible to bring in extra supplies from Konya or so because of the rough terrain. And so we should keep in mind that the transport of bulky material is impossible. And if we have a look on the map, you see that as at Boğazköy, Alacahög, Kuşaklı, Kaman, and other places probably as well, we have the combination of water supply ponds, granaries, within planned cities. The best example is probably here Kuşaklı, where the ponds are the layout of the ponds or the dams is that across the dam the road is leading into the city through the city gate, and within the city you have straight running roads, meeting each other in 90-degree angles. So this city clearly was planned in advance before it was laid out there in the steppes of Anatolia. And we have to keep in mind the break in Boğazköy and Hatusha is already sharp. Boğazköy is the biggest city in this area until modern Turkey. But the area of Kuşaklı here, it's much, much harsh, much more difficult to live. And where still today only very tiny and desperate villages are located, the Hittites were able to build such a complex, large city with 5,000 to 10,000 people living there. Our excavations are now, I want to show some other things, showing especially the development of the upper city, of the southern part of the city, which was researched for more or less 4 decades by different scholars. Peter Neve, who to whom we owe these large-scale excavations of enormous amount of architecture. And despite everything, or despite a lot of details one may discuss or even criticize, it's up to him, and I am personally very grateful to him, first to have an understanding of the city as a whole. That is one thing. And the other thing is that he developed a restoration system in a time when the word restoration was foreign to most of the other expeditions. So in the second half of the 16th century, the turning point I talked so much about, here in the valley west of Sarıkale, modular buildings were encountered. This is made up, the quadrangular ones are made up of 4 units, and then here we have another one, a rectangular one, made up of 2 units. They were laid out, again, a symmetrically street system. So it's very clear at the very beginning that these buildings were built there by people who thought something or had an idea. The interesting thing with these excavations is that for the first time it is clearly visible and touchable the dynamics behind the development of an urban quarter, of an urban part within Hatusha. Due to the approach of my previous excavators, especially Bittel and also Neve, who had the idea of a tell-like stratigraphy of build levels running through the whole city. All plans and all things they published seemed to be very static. So we had slides on the timeline, this point, that point, but we didn't know and we couldn't understand how this developed. Here it is now, luckily, we are in a different position. If I just return, on top of these buildings here come these clumsy workshops, but with very rich finds, by the way. And then on top of them comes again here rather rectangular architecture, which several times was destroyed, this part of the city, by landslides or flood events, and they were so important that they rebuilt them. But the rebuilding process shows us or teaches us much about the dynamics of the Hittite city development. And this is all happening through the 15th and the 14th century. So the city isn't that static as it might look if we just consult the plans. A few of the finds to show also some of the interesting recent art finds: a head of a terracotta statue, a lion's head, and this torso of a figurine, indicating for the first time that those things we see in 2-dimensional reliefs, like in Yazilikaya, are also existing as 3-dimensional figurines. On top, or a little bit to the south here, we again excavated a large, again very symmetrical building, partly destroyed in this area by Byzantine houses or by Byzantine activities. But anyway, and despite the fact that the building was nearly emptied from finds, we were lucky enough to encounter at least several interesting things. The most important one, of course, is a letter sent to the commander of the royal bodyguards. So it is very probable that this building belonged to this high-ranking military officer. The rest is not very important, but the addressee is the thing. And for the first time, by this letter, for the first time, we can pinpoint such a high-ranking person within the city, which is quite interesting. Other finds in the same house also are indicating a connection to the royal family, especially this sales contract has a list of people on it, all high-ranking officials. and seals of kings are showing us that we are in the Middle Hittite period. And, of course, last but not least, in these two southeastern storerooms, we encountered more or less the whole inventory of these rooms, which were used for storage of these plates and pots and so on. To give you an idea, this vase is 1 meter 90 centimeters height, so it's my size, and it's interesting in itself, of course, but it is also interesting because for the first time we know what such a high-ranking officer is doing in the house. Of course, he's living there. Of course, he has we found facilities to mill grain, and there are hearth and ovens and so on and so on. We have the administrative part, as we saw. But this is something we never encountered before in any Hittite context, because here we can see what they used for certain feasts and rituals being performed probably at certain events in these houses. And from the Hittite texts, as well as from other Near Eastern societies, we clearly know that these feasts and all these social events are connected to it are very important for the social build-up of such a society. Yes, what else do we see in the city? So far we talked about things which were excavated. There are many things you can see in Hatusha which are not excavated. We never went underground. And some of them are these strangely shaped rocks. Here you can see still the building on top of it. We will see the drawing later. Here it's completely flattened with these cuttings, and here you see, 20% of the rock has just simply cut away to make a terrace to build a building on top of it. And the same way as Kesikaya, which is here we saw before, the same way these rocks were all built upon. They were all used for certain functions. Here's one. This is Yinejekale, for which I suggest in a book which is at the publisher at the moment, I suggest that this is one of those hekurs. The hekurs are buildings which are connected to the Hittite ancestor cult. But comparing this rock with that rock, it's obvious that this is something different, because here's no architecture. There are no any signs of any negative architecture. No way to build something on. There wasn't built something on top of it. But you see here with these different colors, these are marks of small, tiny, really smoothly flattened areas. Maybe there was something portable built on it. Maybe a tent or tents. I don't know. So I can't tell you the function of this rock, but I can say it's had a different function from the other one. So I should return. So within the city, we have these rocky outcrops which were used for representative purposes, and I have to say that in no other Hittite city, may it as big as Shapinuva or Ortaköy or whatsoever, at none of these cities we have comparable installations. So these installations have something to do with the Hittite state. And that's the same time, so we are still in the 14th and 15th century, it's the same time when we outside the city are encountering buildings. Here, you see in the geophysics there, here and up there even furthermore. Here is you see this, line, that is a pond, as the one excavated in the upper city. In Kushakle, we found the same geophysical traits, also, and then later excavating it as ponds. Here's another one, just cutting off the runoff valley here near Yazilakaya. So we can say that in this time of the 14th and 15th century, or 15th and 14th century, sorry, the vicinity, the close vicinity of the city was intensively used, was used for different purposes. There are official buildings, there are small farmsteads, there are these small-scale irrigation installations. So it must have been a very fruitful and peaceful time. The last chapter again is dealing with I will present a re-evaluation of the results of Peter Neve in the Upper Town. And first, without any dating and without discussing the dating, I just want to show you what is changing. At one point in history, we have these temples. In this plain and the surrounding terraces, at least 28 large temple buildings, which is the central temple city, maybe housing the southern god of the Hittite Empire. And then at a certain point in history, which unfortunately we cannot date at the moment, that was turned into an industrial area with pottery kilns, metal workshops. Most of the temples clearly fell out of use, probably all of them or most of them. And this phenomenon needs an explanation. This phenomenon, from my point of view, cannot be explained by a population rise, because the Anatolian, the Anatolian economic system doesn't support a sharp rise in population up or down, especially on a sharp population increase over a short period, as we know from the Ottoman period. So there must be something else behind it. And actually, a colleague of mine, it's not my idea, it's the idea of Dirk Mielke, and I just find it very attractive and start thinking about it, then it gets even more attractive. I think that the shifting, this also shifted here, the shifting of the capital city from Hatusha to a place called Tarhuntasha, probably in the southern part of central Anatolia, by Muwatalli II. This might be actually the reason for this change in Hatusha, for this architecturally visible change in Hatusha. Why? We know from the Hittite texts that even before the 13th century, the Hittite kings stayed in other towns. They stayed in Ankuva, they stayed in Shapinuva. Tutralia II probably stayed there for most of his life. But these cities never, from my point of view, never became capital. In a sense, not in the sense of a residence of the king, but as I try to show, the Hittite capital city is much, much more, and especially incorporating many buildings and many installations reflecting the ancestors' cult. But Muwatalli makes something completely new. In a text, he states that he takes all the statues of his ancestors and his gods with him to Tarhuntasha. So this is, from my point of view, the sharp difference to all the other incidents where when the Hittite kings lived somewhere else. He tried to move all these special functions, being addicted to Hatusha for, at that point, maybe 3,000 years or 350 years. He wants to shift these functions to another place. And obviously this didn't work, because only the next king, Hattushili, returned to Hatusha. And we know from the textual evidence that Hatusha, in the time when the capital was in Tarhuntasha, and Hattushili was appointed as the governor, what we would say, of Hatusha, it was a living town. It was a developing town. So it wasn't abandoned completely. And after the return, during the period of Hattushili, Tutralia, and especially Shupiluma II, the Hittite kings try immediately to the south here. This is the southern edge of the royal capital of the royal palace area of Büyükkale. These are viaducts running up the hill there, and immediately to the south, the Hittite kings, build new buildings. They build a temple here. On the rock of Nishanttepe, they built this installation, which is, as a opinia communis, by many scholars accepted as a hikur, as one of these buildings of the ancestors cult. And they built the chamber 2 here with the inscription read by David, which is clearly, or in one way or the other, addicted and connected to the cult for the passed away king. So from my point of view, in the last 40, 50 years at maximum of the Hittite Empire, they established those functions which were before present in this place just a few hundred meters to the south, where at that point, in the second half of the 13th century, the smokestacks still were running, the pottery kilns were running. They established the functions they had here, they established here in an area which before probably was not densely used. At least we have no traits of an intensive use in this area before. They rebuilt it here again. They re-established these functions here again. And even we could take Yazılıkaya into account, an open-air sanctuary of the Hittites, especially the Hittite king of Tutraliya IV, the son of Hatusha III, which at least one part of it also was part of the ancestors' cult, or was facilitating the ancestors' cult of that particular king in the late 13th century. So this is, from my point of view, the interesting story, or the fascinating story of an Anatolian capital of an Anatolian principality, of a small kingdom, as we had many in the 18th and 18th century, changing into a city which is comparable to Babylon and Pyramus, just to mention the main players of their time. And as the last picture, I want to dedicate this to Jürgen Seher, his work giving the site also a new face and a new landmark, this rebuilt city wall, and giving you an impression of how mighty this city might have looked like in its peak time, in its climax time in the 15th and 14th century BC. Thank you very much for your attention.
I've been asked to do a short word of thanks for Dr. Schachner's lecture, but before that we do have time for a few questions. So if anybody's got questions, I ask you to keep them short, and we'll see what we can deal with. So if anybody would like to ask questions.
How was the vacuum storage of grain achieved?
These deep holes were filled with grain up to the very top, and then on top of it, without leaving much air, there was put a lime layer, and it's a special material of this region called chorak. It's a serpentinite sand, being waterproofed and cutting off the air from the outside. The grain inside is still continuing to use the rest of the oxygen, and by this a vacuum evolves. And I should mention that now everyone would think, okay, nice with the vacuum, but the mice would have eaten the grain. But the Hittites used a system which is very well attested in with ethnographical comparisons. Between the earth and the grain, they packed a thick layer of straw, and the straw prevented the mice from digging through and coming into the grain. And if they would make it into the grain, the vacuum would have killed them. The lack of oxygen would have then killed them. It's a rather common way to storage grain in the Middle East. I myself excavated such a grain pit in Grigiano. The British Museum did in the Eskimosul area at Castridge Cliff and other sites. So it's something not only typical for the Hittites, but in other areas of the Near East as well.
From Egyptological point of view, the movement of the capital, has it got anything to do with the battles with Ramesses?
That's difficult to say. It was at the peak of the confrontation with the Egyptians, and one might think that this might have been one of the reasons. But on the other hand, the Hittites had to struggle within Anatolia, several civil uprisings and family fights and so on. So it was a very unstable situation. Hatusha, in general, is, from a strategical point of view, very, very unpleasant position to be the capital of an empire which interests are in the south. So moving the capital city to the south at least would benefit from this strategic position. Whether the conflict with Egypt played a role or not is very difficult to say. We don't have the textual evidence for that. And we didn't find Taruntasha yet. There are several places suggested, but it's difficult without any excavations to judge on that.
What do you think actually happened at the end? I mean, did the court and the king march off somewhere else? Is there a Hittite Machu Picchu waiting to be found? Or?
The end is the puzzling question at the moment, or is one of the puzzling questions in Hatusha, because it's clear that in Hatusha we do not find the clue to tell us what happened at the end. Because, as I said, all the large buildings, these temples, the palaces, and so on, they were intentionally emptied when they were excavated. When we found them, when we excavate them, there's nothing on the floors. There's nothing in these buildings, except of those things you would leave behind, the tablets, for example, because if you in a crisis situation, you have to leave such a site, or you are thinking of how to survive. You would leave these tablet archives aren't of any benefit for the system anymore. So what we think is it's a very complicated model of a disintegration of the system. Climate change and connected to it economic problems is one thing. Another thing are the political unrest within central Anatolia. The Hittite kings always had to fight parallel states of the family, parallel parts in Anatolia who wanted to be separate. I can only remember the fight between Hatusha and Taruntasha in the time of Tutralia IV, and so on. So this is another thing. And then the destruction, the chain of destruction at the southern part of Anatolia, at the coastal area, at the very end of the late Bronze Age, when the trade partners of the Hittites were destroyed by the sea people or whatsoever. And the Hittites controlled this trade and probably took the profit of the trade by taxes. And so I think that an integration of these three elements causes the breakdown of the central power of the Hittites. It's interesting that those areas in an economically better position, like the southeast of Anatolia, Kargamish at the peak, but also Malatya and Aleppo and so on, there, what we now call the late Hittite principalities, they flourished. So it's all about, and one thing is economy.
Do you agree or not with the idea that Hatusha III, by usurping the throne from his nephew, fatally undermined the sort of feeling of loyalty towards the royal house and thereby led to disunity?
I totally agree. This is one of the major cracking points in Hittite history, when Hattusili overthrew his nephew, uncle, from the throne and kicked him out. But the difference is, any other Near Eastern empire, the king would have killed him, but the Hittites didn't. So this line continued, and there was always many people who had the right to be king and would fight for it, and would use any crisis for a civil uprising or an internal uprising. And this is the cracking point, which at the end, at least, was one of the reasons for the breakdown of the empire. And maybe I should say one word. The interesting fact with the Hittites is that they completely vanished from history. The Assyrians and all the others, they somehow made it into mankind's memory, but the Hittites not. The Hittites only turned up in 1906, let's say. But no, it's not that simple. But what I want to say is that they complete vanished has also to do something with the fact that an empire of that size and that importance in this region is unusual to Anatolian history if we think in a more structural, long-term way.
Is it possible to gain any overriding view of the density of development within Hatusha? When you show us the maps, there's a lot of development, a lot of blank spaces there.
Yes.
Aerial photography is all of any use?
Well, we do a lot of geophysical surveys, and the geophysical surveys, together with traditional walking surveys and so on, are indicating that most part of the city were used somehow in one way or the other. But the geophysics are difficult because of the geology in Hatusha. It's very magnetic, so we do not see too much, to be honest. I think that the city has, especially in the southern part, in the what we call the upper town, there were many areas which were not very densely built upon. These pond areas, large squares, large areas which were used for things we do not know. The parts of the rocky areas, they were too steep to build something upon it. So it was densely populated, but not as we would think of a modern city or so. There were many empty areas in between.
I'll stop the questions there. We have a reception after this lecture on the floor above us, to which you're all not only invited but warmly encouraged to come, especially those of you who are new to the British Institute at Ankara, as I think many of you are tonight. But before we go up and refresh ourselves, on your behalf I'd like to thank Dr. Schachner for a magnificent lecture. It's a completely fresh view of this unfolding ancient city. I mean, I should say that the British Institute was founded by John Garstang, who had his eye on studying the Hittites, and then Oliver Gurney, throughout his whole career, was passionately engaged with Hittite history, and David Hawkins today carries forward that tradition, and it's a sort of a thin but very distinguished line of British scholarship that runs through. But what has been unfolded today for us is such an enormous subject, not just Hatusha, but the whole Hittite Empire and the whole history that one can see of the second millennium Anatolia sort of here in a sort of incipient form, that I think I would like to see lots more British scholars get involved in all sorts of aspects of this, and let's hope that one or two people have been inspired by this marvellous lecture tonight to follow that that trail. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.